my idea was to not get the usual suspects, but to have public debates. And what I wanted to do, my commitment, mainly because I was an educator, was to reanimate the public square.
Hello and welcome to Confessions. I'm Giles Fraser. This is the podcast where I talk to interesting and well-known guests to try and find out what it is that makes them tick. I'm going to try and drill down into their core beliefs to understand a bit better about who they are and what they're all about. Bearing her soul to me in the stall this week is Claire Fox, director of the Academy of Ideas and one of my co-panellists on Moral Maze. Claire, welcome to Confessions.
Good to be here.
Claire...
Slightly nerve-wracking.
Is it?
It's been a while since I've been to confession.
But presumably, with a name like Claire Regina Fox, which I ever found out, Regina being a reference to the Virgin Mary, you must have been to confessions before.
Oh, it's been a while, but no, confession was a very major part of my life growing up.
So tell me a bit about that Catholic background, because I don't think people know much about that.
Yeah, so I'm from an Irish Catholic background, probably fairly typical of the Irish immigrants who came over, ended up living in North Wales because it was close enough to Liverpool and Holyhead to be able to get the boat for my parents. So there was kind of a sense of we were kind of Irish, Welsh, God knows.
Right.
But we were very definitely Catholics.
Right.
And I took the whole thing very seriously for a very long time, in fact.
Oh, right.
So confession was a very important part of that because, sometimes you had to, when you're very small, you have to almost use your imagination to come up with some sins. You don't want to appear to be too boring.
The worst thing is to go to confession, you've got nothing to confess.
No, exactly. Like,
who wants to be like that?
Exactly. Yeah. So, in some ways it taught me that confession is good for the soul. And I mean, maybe as a metaphor, but I did actually feel better having been to confession. And obviously, as I grew older, there was more to confess. But there was an opportunity to talk, I suppose, to somebody. Often you'd know the priest, but that confessional box as it was set up made you feel as though you were talking to somebody who was not just the priest that you know of your local parish. And so you did find yourself saying things or admitting things or talking through things. So it was it had a kind of religious therapeutic aspect to it.
And Mass was a part of you too.
Oh, Mass was, definitely weekly, more often than that because I went to a Catholic comp and we had, an additional Mass every week. I became one of the people who, as I was in my early teens, would help put those masses on. I thought I was very creative, so I thoroughly enjoyed.
What do you mean? What did you do?
Because you get a chance to do. We'll do a mass on the theme of war or something, and I'd get my Wilfred Owen out and all this sort of thing, and choose the hymns. I loved all that. I think I enjoyed the choreography of it, and that was part of it. And I took it very seriously. And my mother, would go to Mass, not every day, but she was a regular Mass attender rather than just a weekly Mass. So it was very core to us and culturally meant a huge amount because it all our friends, all the families around us went to our school. So we had to travel to school as well. So, we had to make the effort to go to a school that wasn't the local school.
I see.
So it was so you had a sense of identity around Catholicism, definitely.
And I'm presuming, with your background in the RCP, Revolutionary Communist Party, that at some point all of that dropped away.
Yeah, but I mean, it took me quite. I don't want to say it took me. It wasn't an active attempt to get rid of it. But I mean, when I went to university, I was probably very naive, first person in the family to go to university. Not very many people locally went to university. I mean, it was not the done thing, really. And I imagined myself to be incredibly bright. And then I turned up at university and realised I wasn't. I had no real sense of myself coming from an ordinary background or, upper working class, whatever way you'd want to socially describe it, until I went to university. I mean, I thought going to university made me middle class, and in a way it did. But then when I got there, I realised I was a bit different. And I say that because I went as a Catholic, but I'd been thinking about politics because I'd been to Teze, which is a Catholic religious community. I'd actually won some prize and ended up going there. And so I'd been thinking about liberation theology. I sort of saw myself as some bit of politics was there. My parents were political in as much as they read the newspapers, watched the TV, talked about current affairs all the time. My dad varied from being a kind of working class Tory who went out canvassing for them to kind of being cynical about everyone. And my mum voted Labour solidly. You know, it was that kind of. But we talked about politics. So when I went to university, I was a Catholic, but looking round. I went to a Federation of Conservative Students meeting.
Right,
I mean,
right,
I had
right.
no sense I wasn't a conservative, if you see what I mean.
Right, right.
I mean, I went to one meeting, I knew I wasn't. I walked out, never
Yeah.
went back.
Yeah,
I went to Labour club meetings, dull as dishwater.
right.
And I eventually actually joined the Socialist Workers' Party. And I did all that as a practicing Catholic.
Wow.
We had a bit of a lefty priest, Father Louis McRae, Father Mac, and he was, you know, open to talking about politics and religion all the time. So, you know, for a couple of years, I kind of happily, merrily combined these things.
And liberation theology bleeds quite sort of naturally, I guess, into a sort of, you know, hard left type of position.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd gone and met all these. I'd actually met members of religious orders who'd kind of, you know, fought with the Sandinistas or been in South Africa, all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was interested in Ireland because I was from Irish background, and you know, I remember very vividly my mother breaking down and weeping when Bloody Sunday happened. So I had some sense of, without really understanding it, but some sense of liberation and national sovereignty and people fighting for their freedom. And so, but I didn't have very much knowledge of the world. So it was when I went to Thésée, which is in France, met people from all around the world, and then sort of realised there was all these national liberation struggles happening, you know, and that Catholics were involved in them. That was very exciting for me because I suddenly, well, it opened up new horizons. And of course it fed into a kind of revolutionary. I didn't feel as though being a revolutionary and being involved in religion was any contradiction at all. Now, I am not religious now, but I know that those religious opportunities made me think. And I mean, I always say, you know, I thought more in my RE lessons about morality than a lot of people would be exposed to. Because interestingly, you know, if you're told that, for example, abortion is a sin, or even sex before marriage, or, you know, contraception, which was, they might, I don't know whether they still say that even in Catholic Church, but, you know, these things were kind of quite morally challenging, you know, and they didn't say it to you like learn the catechism. I mean, I had teachers who, they were trying to win our hearts and minds and our souls, I suppose, but which made me have to think from, you know, 13, 14. I'm sorry to go on about this, but it's funny because my mum is in a home, and I've just we've just sold the house to pay for it, and out of the attic came all of these old school books, and I was genuine. I mean, you know, I haven't gone through everything, but I kind of found these books for me at 12, 13, 14. And it was the RE lessons that really struck me, where I'd be writing essays about quite profound things. That's not because I was profound, but because I was asked to consider those profound
You've seen
things.
the essays. Have you got the
It's
essays?
in this. I've got the essays. There's some fabulous ones.
And do
I
you
mean,
see
there is
do
a
you see
funny one.
today's Claire Fox? Do you see her in the essays that you read?
I remember the idealism, and there is a very funny one about how I grew up to be a communist before I saw the error of my ways, which did make me laugh. How the idealism of communism, and then I had to learn the hard lessons. But I was writing this when I was like 13 and imagining the future, so that's quite funny. I can't see it. It's not unfamiliar to me. A bit goody two shoes, but in the sense of kind of obviously aspiring to want to have a set of beliefs.
And you still strike me as a cultural Catholic.
I think that's true. I mean, you know, until only a few months ago, I was, you know, taking my mum to mass whenever I went home, which was every, you know, 2 or 3 weeks. I went to mass at the weekend without my mother because I get on very well with the priest near where my mother is.
Do you take communion?
I take communion.
So there we are.
And
she's like, by the way, this is really funny. So we're actually on a podcast, and she just said, I'd take him in, and then she put a finger up to her mouth to say, whispering, I didn't just say that.
The point I'm making is that these things have been hugely important to my family. And when my dad died when he was in his 60s, which was very young, and, as it were, the Catholic community, my mother, who made a very funny comment to me, when my dad died, it was very tragic because he died, in 3 months of cancer, it was sort of, and he was a life force, and we all adored him and everything. But my mum said to me, "Oh, I really don't want to be a widow." And I think what she meant was that she remembered her own mother and my dad's mother and that generation before her, that when the husbands died, they kind of took to wearing black and that was it. My mum was mid-60s. She didn't want that to be the case. So we made a resolution that she wouldn't. And to be fair, although she's got Alzheimer's now, for the next 20 years, I mean, her early 80s, she's, off travelling around the place and, went to America. You know what I mean? Like, so we kind of stuck with that. And I just want to credit the local Catholic church and people around it because she got a new lease of life. And she helped actually build a new church in the local area with some money from my dad and things like that.
Oh.
Yeah.
So let's take it on from here. So you go to university and then sort of left-wing politics, I presume that's the point when left-wing politics begins to play a more prominent role in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I started to take myself and politics seriously, largely because I knew I was dabbling. And at Warwick in university in those days, every week there was 1,000 people at Union General meetings, if you can imagine that, every Thursday. And I'd sit at the back in my first year and kind of watch these arguments and kind of realised that I wasn't sure what I thought about a lot of the issues. And I started reading more and I started going to meetings and started thinking a bit. As I said, I got involved in the Socialist Workers' Party. I without wishing to be sectarian, I found them crass and superficial, and it wasn't really. But they did introduce me to revolutionary Marxism, and even at the level of slogans, I kind of became familiar with that world. And then I got involved in Irish politics and anti-racist politics, and in both instances, I didn't really agree with the Socialist Workers' Party. I was more hardline on Ireland. I felt that they were, they concentrated far too much on, the anti-Nazi League rather than serious anti-racism. And at the time in Coventry, there was, there's a lot of racist attacks, and I was very animated and outraged by that. So, and then I stumbled across a group that nobody had heard of in Warwick. Weren't in Coventry. I went on a demonstration and bought a newspaper called The Next Step, which was a revolutionary communist tendencies paper. And I brought it back to Warwick, read it. I remember reading it on the bus home and thinking, they agree with everything I think. Like all of these things.
So for those people listening who are not fully versed in the complexity of hard left sort of politics, what would be the difference between the SWP and the RCP?
Well, the differences are too difficult to explain now, but both are Trotskyist organisations. The Revolutionary Communist Party, as it became, was very small in comparison with the Socialist Workers' Party, which was very large at the time, relatively. And the Revolutionary Communist Party took theory very seriously, a huge amount of reading and encouragement to debate and discuss, and was trying to reimagine and reconceive of Marxism for that period, and particularly rejected things like voting for the Labour Party or the state taking over too much role in people's lives, felt that the British tradition of kind of having sided with the Labour Party and the state and the welfare state was problematic. And then a million other things. We're particularly concerned with not being economistic and accommodating to the working class, but actually taking a lead when it came to things like oppression, fighting for Irish freedom or fighting racism or fighting for in solidarity internationally. So there were distinctions, but it feels, doesn't it, like an age ago.
Yeah.
Because it was an age ago. I remember it, of course, vividly, and yet what listeners won't know was that, that this was a major preoccupation, and if you were a student or if you were a young person in the 80s, well, I mean, presumably before, but well into the 80s, everybody was involved in politics.
I was doing and I was doing the same as you. I mean, I was involved in the same things, and for me it was the other way around. I hadn't come from a religious background, but I was heading that
Right,
way.
yeah,
so
yeah.
we probably cross somewhere around on a selling socialist worker.
But I'll tell you one thing that was interesting was that the Socialist Workers' Party, did try and kind of persuade me not to be religious.
They did.
There were attempts at, people who sort of say you can't be religious in the revolution, which actually, of course, is true if you're a materialist. But one thing that the RCP kind of didn't bother.
Oh.
They by which I mean, they took me seriously and I worked it out. I myself just drifted away from that tradition.
Yeah. And so you spent quite a long time, didn't you, in that world? There was, I don't know, 20 years or so that you were in that world, and then obviously there's something else that's happened as well. So what I always think of the Claire Fox puzzle is that you are both somebody that's on the left. I would, and you self-describe as on the left, and yet there's a sort of this strong libertarian tendency that's happened. So that's very different. So that's a combination that's one that a lot of people don't completely get.
Well, I think there's two strands. First of all, I was in the Revolutionary Communist Party, but when I say I had a life, I mean I had jobs, I was working, I was teaching for a long time, and in a set of circumstances that were kind of a bit peculiar, which I actually took a year off teaching to start PhD to see if I got unpaid sabbatical. I got the opportunity to take over running Living Marxism and relaunching it as LM magazine. So the demise of basically the Revolutionary Communist Party folded. But at the end of the Cold War, it was decided that there was just no basis for this, and that we'd just become some sect, and that everybody could, that we'd have a loose network, but that everybody kind of go away. But we had this successful.
This was early 90s, right?
Yeah. Oh, God, I can't remember.
No,
it was, yeah. And we had a successful magazine, Living Marxism, which was wide, had a base, a reader base and all that sort of thing, and so on. So it was suggested, or a group of us thought, well, why don't we and I kept saying, we should relaunch as a current affairs magazine. And because I had this year off, I ended up being, myself and somebody called Helena Goldberg, decided that we'd do it because we felt that we had, we never worked, as it were, for this party. We weren't the inside crowd particularly, so we did it. And the first issue, we got sued for libel by ITN, which was probably one of the things that changed my life completely, because what it meant was I felt responsibility for this magazine that I'd relaunched, and then I wasn't named in the libel action as well, so I felt even worse. I felt like it doesn't matter about the libel action. When I say it doesn't matter, one can't discuss it in detail because of the libel action. But for 3 years, we had to fight a libel action. And the reason I tell you that is because the whole idea of this LM magazine was that it was time to go beyond left and right. And to get together.
That was one of the core ideas.
That was one of the core ideas. Now, when we were saying beyond left and right, we were saying everything's thrown now by the collapse of Stalinism, politics being thrown up in the air, the emergence of new Labour, Blairism, and kind of technocratic politics. And we were, the libertarianism thing is mysterious to me because freedom has always animated my politics all the time through the RCP, but people now associate
liberation
freedom.
theology.
Exactly, associate freedom with more. Now it's like they assume you're on the right and you believe in the free market, whereas that wasn't really. It's the kind of freedom of the individual to decide their destiny, personal sovereignty side. So LM magazine was very much animated by that, and we carried on for 3 years, and we had to raise a lot of money to pay for a pro bono top barrister, and we lost the libel case. But we didn't lose our credibility in as much as the judge concluded that we'd been factually accurate. And although the case was all over the newspapers, some people will still, say things that we never ever argued. But the But actually, we retained a certain credibility. But what happened then was I was thrown into the public sphere. Do you remember? Until then, I was a private individual. I was in the RCP, and I was a teacher. But suddenly, I was going out lobbying people and sort of, when I say lobbying, like going to book festivals and queuing up so I could talk to an author and say, "Would you sign our free speech petition?"
Right.
And then trying to get into the media to get the case known about. And through that, I became a bit of a public persona. And so what happened was the light was shone on my politics. It wasn't that my politics had all changed, it's just that nobody really knew. And part of my big thing was free speech, because we'd been sued for libel. That was and we'd set ourselves up as a free speech magazine. One of the first things I organised in that role, was a thing called Free Speech Wars, a big festival at the ICA. And it was kind of a model I've deployed for a long time since, which was my idea was to not get the usual suspects, but to have public debates. And what I wanted to do, my commitment, mainly because I was an educator, was to reanimate the public square. And so free speech was my big thing. And I got picked up a few times. For example, I was asked to be a witness on the Moral Maze. That's my first, they sort of said, "Oh, there's this woman who's doing this free speech thing." And I went on. I was a witness 2 or 3 times. And then they asked me to stand in on the panel, So in a way, that was how I entered that world.
So explain this. So it sounds like you were very early then in picking up that thing that people talk about much more nowadays, that left and right have just become meaningless categories, or we've got to get beyond them and so forth. But I'm surprised that you were thinking that in the sort of 90s, because not a lot of people were saying that sort of thing in the 90s.
No. I think that everybody who had been involved in the left, people don't maybe understand the profundity of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which I had longed for many a year. Because I was a Trotsky, I had no time. I knew that they had corrupted everything that I believed ideally would come out of, any kind of communist societies. But what that meant was that when Margaret Thatcher said there is no alternative, or Francis Fukuyama said the end of history, it did feel like that, because what it felt like then was, this is it now. This is the only system we can have. And I didn't believe that that was true, but I knew that there was no point just going on. You know what I mean? So in a way, you had to stop in your tracks and say, right, what does politics mean now if you're left-wing, progressive, whatever you are?
Did you ever get tempted by the Blairite option?
Oh, no, that, I have to say, never. At no point. They were doing something different, but everything that they were doing I hated. So no, that was never my... But I think that they did also symbolise that politics was changing. And so you felt that, well, now, these kind of like clear distinctions left and right. And also, in the midst of all of that, of course, we'd had in this country the defeat of the miners' strike. You could see that kind of working class resistance and politics had basically taken a massive bashing. And it wasn't just the miners' strike, but effectively the traditional left-right, even bosses, workers, all these kind of dichotomies were just over. And
but
so
I took a different reaction to the time. So I was just, the miners' strike. This was Scargill versus Thatcher. So it was it had sort of polarised left right to me. It made it sharper to me.
Oh no, well it did. Oh no, I mean the miners' strike was very important for my politics. Although in fact the Revolutionary Communist Party were arguing that there should have been a ballot for it to be democratic, which got us some stick at the time from some people on the left. But a lot of miners agreed with us, as it happens, to the left, because they felt that Scargill was not winning the arguments internally in the union. But that to one side. What I mean is, after the defeat of the strike,
right.
There was a demoralised atmosphere, and obviously the atmosphere was such that the trade unions kind of can't finish now. You know what I mean? And people felt like they'd been sold out, and actually partly, by the way, because they never kind of admitted to being defeated, but everybody knew. And then, of course, there was all sorts of things happening. The war in Ireland that was obviously kind of coming to an end, but not necessarily in a way that was going to lead to the United Ireland that many people had fought for, or what have you. So you felt that, and a lot of the political drivers around liberation struggles around the world were being replaced in a rather unpleasant way. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, or in Africa, things that had it was politics that animated freedom struggles, and they were being replaced, for example, in the Middle East, often by religion, like by the rise of radical Islam. And things were getting very complicated. International relations would change because the Cold War had also animated the West and the Western establishment, because they could always say, well, at least we're not like them. And they always had an enemy. And then without an enemy, they didn't have an enemy. So everyone was disorientated. And I was just determined to try and find a way of having an open enough conversation to try and understand the world and come out of it with some progressive politics at the end.
So you and I are both on the moral maze. Are you a moral thinker or a political thinker?
Well, I don't know what kind of thinker I am, but I do try and think morally as well as politically. But I do think they're quite similar. But what I think people think political thinking is policy thinking. And so I'm not a policy wonk. And so when people say, oh, that they're involved in politics, they're often involved in the how to run society, the administration. Now, of course, now I'm a middle-aged woman, not like the idealistic student I was. So it's not that I don't understand that people have to run things. And even in my brief, I had a period when I was elected as a student union full-time officer in mid my career, to everyone's surprise, as a Revolutionary Communist Party person. And then I suddenly had to run the bar, run the accounts. And I couldn't just stand up and make inspiring speeches. You know what I mean? I had staff. So I've kind of, now I run the Academy of Ideas. I have staff. I have rent. I have to pay salaries. I have to raise money. I have to run a mini business.
Capitalist running dog.
Yeah. So, but I'm definitely more in the ideas front. And I think that politics without that kind of moral thinking can make some terrible errors. I understand it, but
and so if we're going to sort of move over to the moral side, because I've heard your political sort of narrative, which is, so is there a sort of core Claire Fox sort of animating moral sort of engine that's going on, where there's some really absolutely key sort of things that are morally that are crucial to you?
So I think that treating each and every human being as if they are myself, i.e. respecting their moral autonomy, is one of my key issues. And that's where the freedom...
You nearly said love your neighbour as yourself.
Exactly, and I was conscious that it's of that ilk. I actually, you don't have to love them, but understanding that they are moral beings.
Yeah.
And I think that's, having a respect for humanity. So, if you want, I'm a humanist in that sense. And that's where the freedom comes from, knowing that, allowing people to have control of their destiny. That personal sovereignty, that word, but, that they are the sovereign of their lives. That seems to me to be one of the key changes historically that's happened, which was that we were determined by outside forces, we were told, and, once a serf, always a serf, and you knew your place and all the rest of it. And that recognition that emerged broadly around the Enlightenment, but the Renaissance and Enlightenment time, which was that people and everyone, and then eventually we realised, you could be the servant or the master or the what have you. Everyone could equally think morally. That's one of my driving forces. And I also think that I'm an old-fashioned educator. I think having been a teacher, I chose to be a teacher, obviously. I mean, I taught in further education, but that sort of idea of pass it on, largely because I just know that if I hadn't had teachers in what wasn't a very good school, had been a secondary modern, went to a comp, teachers who introduced me to the best that's known and thought, that changed my life, I still get, a gulp in my throat thinking of that, and I try and do the same.
When you talk about the liberation of the individual, one of the ways in which we're often set off against each other on moral maze is that you would be a more individualist type of thinker and I'd be more a communitarian type of thinker. Is there a bit of you that feels anxious about the way in which individualism contemporary individualism is also a sort of alibi for, I don't know, a sort of adjacent to a sort of self-absorption, or the sort of the problems, people cut off loneliness, people cut off with community. I mean, you talk very, movingly about North Wales community, Catholic community in North Wales. So just,
Yeah, no, I think there is a balancing act there, and I'm conscious of it. So I am a great critic of the kind of narcissistic me aspects of contemporary society, and I think that self-absorption and turning in on oneself is completely unhelpful. I think that sometimes people misunderstand individualism because, and of course it can go either way, but for me the importance of stressing the individual is because so often it's the groupthink or the kind of collective which can be told to kind of pipe down, you don't matter. We're doing it for the best interests of society, so you're irrelevant. And because I've already said that one of the big animating ideas I've got is everyone being seen as an individual, autonomous being, and respecting that, I get anxious that some of the more communitarian side, I mean, not so much communitarian, but, like nudge, it's kind of like you treat everybody as kind of like as though they're kind of things to be done to, acted upon, and moved around, like they don't count. It also strikes me that the collective needs to be full of strong individuals. There's no, otherwise it's just a blob. And so, of course, I still believe that, that we won't, that one would never change anything historically if it's just like one person here and one person, But it's the coming together of those independent, morally autonomous agents that makes history change. That's what I think.
But I'd also associate you with being something of a critic of the ways in which the autonomous individual can self-define simply through an act of will. I'm thinking of, gender type of arguments that we're having at the moment. Is that a fair thing?
Oh, that's absolutely fair. I mean, the thing about self-definition is the thing about individual consciousness and being is that you become someone. The struggle of life is to create yourself in a way. And so that sounds as though I'm going to say, so now I can declare gender at any time. But when I say I mean morally, don't I? And usually in reference to society. So I don't think, that's why I'm such a critic of identity politics. I don't think that it's helpful for me to say, well, you can know that I'm Irish. You can find out lots of things about me from that, or Welsh, or whichever hat I choose to wear. But to sort of say that explains me, finishes me off before I've started, and also gives me no responsibility for what I have to do now and what I have to do next, and the becoming who I want to be, which is, I consider, an ongoing issue. I'm not nowhere near where I want to be. And so I think that's, otherwise you're just passive and you're kind of at the receiving end of things that are not your responsibility, right? So that's one side of it. The Gender Recognition Act at the moment is suggesting self-ID, which it does strike me as being much more of a sense of entitlement, which is a demand that I tell you who I am and you must treat me. And that's not what I'm talking about.
Wouldn't that grow naturally out of your your celebration of the sovereign nature of the individual?
No, not just by demanding. I mean, I could say I'm a great thinker and it wouldn't make it true. And I demand you, me, right? You must act. Now, this is very different, by the way. And of course it is, which is that there are people who want to change their gender. And I think that the arrangements through which, living in a particular gender for 2 years and some of these things are perfectly serious and do not discriminate and are a reasonable way to treat people with respect. Indeed, if anyone even said to me, call me Z, or, I know I was John last week, but I'm Janet now, call me Janet. I wouldn't go John just for the sake of being mean.
Yeah.
But to turn public life on its head on the basis of demands of what actually has not become a group of individuals but has become a groupthink demand, I think is wholly dangerous. So, and I actually am a live, let live. I don't care how people describe themselves or live. I don't care about their sexual preferences, and I don't care. I'm very liberal on that front. They have to make their own moral choices, and one can make, and I'm very I'm more than happy with that. But that's different than reorganising society around a recognition of, I want you to tell me now that this is what I am, and so on and so forth. Right. There's no discrimination going on, by the way, in the midst of this. And I think that to try and deny biology in the midst of a liberation discussion really is far-fetched. But then, that doesn't mean that there aren't complicated matters around people's identity that one wouldn't want to be both sensitive, kind about, and in fact, liberal about.
I want to plug this question, not the question about gender, but I want to plug this question about the relationship between the individual and the community just one more time, because we have a let's say a millennial generation now growing up that's grown up with a strong sense of individual rights and individual place in the world. And yet one of the things that you've been a critic of is, or seem to be a critic of, is this particular generation, snowflakes and all the rest of it and so forth. So I'm just trying to place those two things together, Claire. Do you see what I'm trying to do?
I can entirely. So I've just written something on narcissism, trying exactly to understand this, because if I can use an analogy, you're 14 and you read a book. And that book, it might be a novel, it might be a historical book, but you take into you new information, new ideas, your imagination spots. It makes you a different person. You are a different person as a consequence. And then you want to share that with everyone. You go and tell people. That is kind of the individual growing and burgeoning. And I want people to be able to experiment in living and thought and what they read and discussions they have as they grow up and into adulthood, as they develop their individual personalities.
This is you, the educator, isn't it?
This is me, the educator. At the moment, we are told to respect young people because they're young, which is kind of an accident of their birth date and won't last. And also that when they say you must listen to me, rather than it being something where they're using the outside world as a resource to develop themselves, it's much more inwardly focusing, and it's being encouraged that way. And we are told that we aren't to criticise young people or it will damage their self-esteem, whereas I actually think we owe it to young people to be critical, not cruel, and to say, no, you're wrong, or you could improve, or what have you. Not to be told to not do that because what would we know, or that we betrayed a generation. I mean, if you feel that you know something and that some young people are doing something wrong, I think you have an obligation to say, look, you're young and I can tell you haven't been around a bit. They don't have to accept it, but I think we should have the courage to do it. And there is a tension at the moment. So one of the things about the snowflake generation, which is a phrase that I'm blamed for, but which is a derogatory and unpleasant phrase, I understand that. But I do fear that young people are being overly mollycoddled and not allowed to develop their individual resilience and so on, because we're overprotecting them as a group on the basis of protecting them as individuals from any possible hurt or harm.
Except I also think, where I look two ways on this, because I feel a bit of that, but I also, having young kids myself, I think, goodness gracious me, I wouldn't want to grow up with social media stuff, with the way in which this is, clearly the bullying, the way in which it's harmful to social identity, to your identity and your self of worth and self-respect, and but also we also live in a sort of febrile political environment, Brexit and all that sort of stuff. So you're getting your battle of ideas, aren't you?
Well, it's not really a battle of ideas, is it? But just on the young people in social media, I mean, I'll often hear, and many young people will say, we're a uniquely suffering generation because you didn't have you didn't have Facebook or social media. And obviously these are new challenges, but they're not uniquely suffering. I mean, and even internationally, you do think, come on. But actually, we've had a few debates recently with teenagers, and I've been surprised at them sort of saying, yeah, actually people talk about cyberbullying, but in other words, people play the game. They kind of know that you can say cyberbullying, but really it's a row. So it's not just, and also, anyway, these are just words, and you have to say, right, this is the world that you now live in, where people can be horrible to you and you don't get enough likes on Instagram, right? And I'm now, as an adult, going to tell you that is the least important aspect of life, and you shouldn't worry about it. Not accommodate to it and overprotect people. That's sort of what I'm saying. The different point you've raised, which is that we're bringing young people into a moment historically of febrile, vicious division, is very troubling to me. But what I suppose one could say is that it's a mixture of two things. Brexit in this country happens to be the moment which is, for once, liberated politics. And remember, most young people, younger than you and I, were reared in it. There is no alternative. This is it. And the status quo prevailed. Now everybody knows that this isn't it. It might be that they're confused and discombobulated because everything's thrown up in the air, and it's a bit scary because you know what the future's like. But in a way, that's also quite refreshing because you get a chance now. You get a chance to shape things. You realise politics isn't stuck, that you yourself and you and your colleagues and you and your mates, you and your peers can actually be the ones that change the world the way you want it to. Whereas we've basically been told for 25 years, so no, don't worry. You go off and live your...
sort of said that, didn't he?
And also, while you're over there doing that, we'll kind of go and tinker over here. And of course, that then, by the way, led to identity politics. People weren't satisfied with that, so they looked to where the means of finding meaning. Not necessarily progressive ones, in my view. Yeah, so I know it's febrile, and I want to take it down a notch or two. And God knows it's not the battle of ideas when people are just screaming it past each other from their echo chambers on Facebook. But on the other hand, there are very exciting aspects of this. And I think so many millions of people felt that moment, particularly when Brexit happened, that I think that the democracy's been shaken up in a positive way, and so I'm generally quite optimistic despite everything.
Yeah, you're an optimist rather than a pessimist, aren't you?
I am, I think. Because I believe in people. I mean, I don't want to be... I mean, there is a danger of being wide-eyed and naive. But I think I look for what the possible is, and, I don't know if you work with people like this, but there are times over the years that I've worked with people who know... they'll come up to you and say, oh, we've got a problem with this. And they'll tell you the problem endlessly. And I just think, yeah, all right, moving on. And there are people you work with who come up and they say, we've got a problem with this. So what I've thought is we'll work this out. I.e., they're problem solvers. And it's such a joy. You just think, working with someone who can see how, give it a go. And I want to be that person, not the whinger. I whinge all the time. But I try not to and try and be the other person.
Claire Fox, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.